I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I work with families. I've worked with families who have newborn babies all the way through elderhood, clients in their 80s and 90s. I have about a little over 10 years of experience working with families with very young children, so children under the age of 3, and their parents. I also have training in grief and loss, so that's sort of another component of my practice, is working with people who are dying or who have just experienced the death of somebody close to them, their child, their parent, someone in their family. And I spent about a year working with teenagers in that grief process through a public high school.
MFT, which stands for Marriage and Family Therapist Associate. The associate part implies that I'm not quite licensed. So you're an intern. It used to be called intern, now it's called associate, until you submit your hours, take an exam, and then get your license. So I'm not licensed yet, so I'm an associate at Camarillo Hospice, which is actually not a hospice, even though it seems like it would be. Camarillo Hospice functions under the umbrella of Livingston Memorial, which does offer hospice services, and all the services are free of charge.
Been a CASA volunteer for just about 20 years, so it's really taken up a large portion of my adult life. I was drawn to it from some projects that I had worked on, and I said that when I retired, that was what I wanted to do with my time. I've had 20 different appointees. I have number 19 and number 20 right now. I also am lucky that I don't have to work for pay. So I've also supervised other CASA volunteers with their cases. I've probably supervised 500 volunteers over the last, I've been doing that for about 17 years. So many volunteers. I go to court a lot to help the CASAs, and I also do a lot of training.
I had one child. She was 3, and she was starting preschool, and I felt like I had, more to give, and I knew there was a need, and I think what started as I saw some little display somewhere about becoming a foster parent, and I thought, we could do that. We have the means, and I have the time, and so we just signed up for the training, and and fairly quickly we got called. They did need people, and our thought was we have space. If a child needs a permanent home, that's great, but if we can just be there, for them, it's a super hard thing to do, right? They come in, you love them like they're your own, and then they go, and it's very hard. But I always told myself that somewhere in their, deep down in their hearts and in their brains, they had an experience of being in a stable and loving family for whatever time they were with us, and that's gonna carry them through whatever obstacles they have in their life, if they don't end up in that kind of a family, they still have had that experience at some point, and that's all you can tell yourself, right? That you made a difference somehow in that short time that you had them, because it's very hard to let them go and not know what's going to happen to them.
The program that we are starting is called Abriendo Puertas, Opening Doors, and that is it's a evidence-based curriculum that is designed for Latino parents with children 0 to 5. And I didn't create the curriculum. I didn't start this. It's just a partnership, essentially, that I'm building with an organization in Los Angeles that designed the curriculum. They have a lot of years in working on this, and a lot of success. It's evidence-based, so it's been evaluated across a couple pretty rigorous studies to show that it does have impact for the participants. So that program is 10 different modules, and it's a parent education program. And I'm going to be leading that starting this fall.
The mission is to make therapeutic childcare and preschool accessible to homeless children or children who have been homeless or at risk for homelessness. A child family psychotherapist for over 30 years when I lived in Washington, D.C. And when I moved out here to California, I decided I didn't want to continue doing psychotherapy per se. I didn't want to do that, but I've always, want to be in some kind of helping position. And we live down very close to the ocean, so we would walk along the ocean, and I'd see so many homeless families. I'd see homeless people sleeping on the beaches. I'd see kids, little children aged 2 and 3 up very, very late at night because their mom was still walking around trying to find a safe place to sleep at night. And so I just became very aware that that as wonderful of a town this is, and we love being here, that there were some real needs that were not being met. And just at that time, there were some other social workers in the area, in the community, that had been looking at the problems and the needs of the homeless, and had identified that yes, there are children that are not, these very young children that are not being served. So we formed a task force, and out of that we incorporated into a nonprofit. So I guess I came into this feeling like this is something that really, having been a psychotherapist and seeing what happens when children don't get the help they need, how their lives turn out, just felt like this was a really good place to invest time and energy and money in doing something as early as possible in a child's life.
The role of a CASA volunteer, as I see it, is to shepherd a child through a difficult time in their life. They come into the system, the court dependency system, at different stages in their life. Some are very young, some come in as teenagers. They all come through with different baggages, different ordeals that they've had to endure, and we just try to meet them at their level and just help them through a tough
Latino
time.
children are the least likely to participate in any preschool or early childhood programs than any other racial or ethnic group. There's a lot of reasons for that, cultural reasons, just access and knowledge, and so we already know that they're at a disadvantage because of that. So we have a lot of programs out there, but perhaps they're not culturally affirming. They're not in the language that people are familiar with, so they don't end up going, and they're kind of already behind. So I would say in that sense that makes them more vulnerable.
Kids, they go home every night. Even if their parents move to a bigger house or a different house in the neighborhood, they have that assurity that this is their home. They have a bedroom. They have a place that they play with their toys. They have a place to put their toys. Many of the homeless children, they don't have toys at home because there's no place to put them. They don't have, can't have that in shelters, things like that. So just the richness of the environment that children who have experienced stable housing all of their lives, just the richness of knowing, just things that they have that promote learning and promote development, toys, books, those kinds of things. The homeless kids don't have that, and so it's a very stark environment.
I think of vulnerable populations are mostly children and the elderly, and anyone that sort of is at a disadvantage, culturally, socioeconomically, whatever it might be. But so a lot of the because our services are free, a lot of the clients that come in are specifically coming to us because we specialize in grief, but also because it's free. So a lot of them have really diverse backgrounds. A lot of the losses are traumatic losses. So they're vulnerable in a lot of ways. I mean, they're vulnerable often before the death of their loved person, and then they're experiencing grief and loss. So, yeah, I think they're pretty vulnerable.
Some of the vulnerabilities that newborns and infants experience is just the fact of, being such a new person in the world. And their vulnerabilities might be medical, might be birth trauma, but also might be related to their parents' vulnerabilities, right? So an infant might be in a vulnerable situation based on, for example, mom's psychological capacity. If mom or dad is depressed or anxious, then that can put the baby in a more vulnerable situation. So kind of attending to parents more so than, babies or infants at that sort of stage of life, right? And as kids grow older, their vulnerabilities might be economic, they might be social, they might have to do with the neighborhoods, that they live in. All of which are that's outside the child's control, right? So these are social and environmental factors that sort of impact a child's vulnerability. When I worked with high school students, most of them were in somewhat unstable living situations. So, for example, perhaps they came to this country without their parents. So their parents lived in another country, and they were here living with friends or extended family, or had some kind of unstable housing situation, and were still going to high school and still showing up and coming to class every day. But they didn't have sort of that tight family network to support them through high school. Other students were involved in gangs, and so their family, friends, neighborhoods were involved in really violent behavior, and sometimes those were the deaths that those kids had experienced, where their friends had been shot and killed, or family members had been shot and killed, or family members had been sent to prison for crimes they had committed. So that's kind of a whole other level of vulnerability, right? Is sort of growing up surrounded by so much violence and having that either the separation, family being incarcerated, or friends being killed, or having to move frequently because of sort of the dynamics of gang violence in the neighborhood, all contributed to those students' sense of vulnerability. So even though they weren't really, really young, they were 14 to 18, I would consider them, really vulnerable.
All kids are vulnerable. I think that this population is extra vulnerable because they haven't had good role models, and they don't know how to exercise good judgment based upon what they've seen. And I think that does make them vulnerable to poor choices, to poor health, taking general responsibility for themselves. And that's where I see the CASA volunteer comes in and shows them that there's another way to look at things. Not necessarily another way to do things, because everybody does things differently, but there's another way to look at life and how to succeed in life.
I come from a place of privilege, and I have, my upbringing was in Mexico, but, we always spoke English and Spanish in my household, so I'm bilingual, and, I obviously understand the culture here. I've been educated in the United States, and I also am very familiar with, the realities of people who don't have the same privileges that I do. And I've always been drawn to helping, my community in whatever way I can. So I know that given my fortune, I can really be a bridge builder between the two communities. And so right now, that was sort of the work that I did professionally before I moved to Ojai. I worked, mainly in nonprofit work and in grants and working with disadvantaged youth and families. So it's always been a draw to me to be able to give back. But now that I'm in Ojai, I see the great need and the fact that there aren't a lot of positions, at least visible positions, of people in leadership roles that are Latino and Hispanic. So to me, that's sort of a red flag, like something's going on. We're in California. There's obviously a lot of Latino people in the area. We're here in Ojai, yet I see there to be like a disconnect. There's definitely two communities, and that is something that I don't feel good about. If we're going to live here, I want to do my best to kind of bring the communities together.
We only fostered infants. So I think that people who foster older children or teenagers, they're saints. They're bringing all of their lifetime of difficulty to your home with you, and it's a amazing thing. We did not do that. We decided we wanted to have children younger than our child, and so at that time they were infants, and so it's a little bit easier, right? A baby, all they need is you to love them, and particularly with the foster kids, I just I was just going to hold them all the time, I wasn't going to let them cry themselves to sleep, or, I knew they would just be with me for a little while. So they were just going to have somebody who gave them whatever they needed it when they needed it as a baby, so I carried them with me everywhere, and I, made sure that I held them to go to sleep, I hope that they felt, in their little hearts that they had somebody answering what they needed. I feel like the foster care program is a really positive thing, right? If you can, children that need homes, if you can place them with families and not in orphanages or group homes and things like that, I think it's a positive thing for the kids. And so I think the idea of it is really good. Sometimes it doesn't work to its ideal, right? Sometimes the social workers have too many cases. They can't keep track of the kids, in as much as they should, and it's a very hard job for them too. Imagine having child after child, hundreds of them. You kind of probably lose a little bit of your compassion over time, and it becomes more of a job than a calling. And so we found that some of the social workers that we worked with could have been a little more caring, and also sometimes, especially in the bigger cities, there are people that do foster care for the wrong reasons, right? And don't take good care of those children. And so I think the difficulty is monitoring that. That's why they come to our house, to make sure. But if you're in a big city and you have thousands of children that you're responsible for, maybe you don't get out to see those children, or maybe you figure it's better than the alternative, which is nowhere. The county pays people to be a foster parent, pays for their care, and so sometimes people will have too many kids just to have the money to take care of them, and not really take care of them, use the money for things that they shouldn't be, and things like that. So it does need, I think, it could be better, it could be, if everybody was, kind and caring every minute, it would be what it should be, but that isn't always the case, and so we see that sometimes that doesn't work well. You hear those cases of a child being badly hurt or killed in foster care or something like that, and that's, you wonder how that can happen. That's how it can happen. That there's just too many. So that's what the government can do, I guess, have more staffing so that people don't get burnt out, and and can monitor these kids.
I'm not going to change every aspect of that child's life, but if I can change or shift one little aspect of that child's focus or knowledge or anything like that, then I think I've been a success. Sometimes, I don't know what success I've had in many of the cases. Maybe years from now, someone will look back and say, oh, I remember when she said this, or I remember when we went such and such a place.
One of the things that people don't know is they believe if it's a young child that they won't remember, so they'll forget. So even though they maybe were homeless, now they've got shelter, and so they should feel better. And actually what we know from two things about brain research. One thing we know is that the earlier the trauma, the less able the child is to understand it because they don't have words. Most of our memories we have words for it. We have stories in our mind that tell us, what happened, but they don't. A young child, a baby, might cry for days and hours at a time because they're scared and they don't know why they're scared. So the earlier the trauma is actually the more difficult for children to recover from. And that's something a lot of people don't know. They just think they don't remember it, so it can't possibly be affecting them. But it's actually affecting them more because they don't have a way to remember it that makes sense. The other thing that a lot of people don't know is that the brain develops more in the first 3 years of life than any other time in life. The adolescent brain does a lot of changing, but the actual development of the brain in the first 3 years of life is
That's why I said
crucial.
the most difficult thing is loving them and giving them away. It's really, really very hard, and especially when you don't know what's going to happen. And you don't, sometimes they go into really bad situations after they leave you, and there's nothing that you can do about it. You don't have any control. They're not your children when they're in foster care. You can't just make a decision like even to get their hair cut. You have to get permission for that. They are not yours. They belong to their parents, and they belong to the county system, and you have to get permission for any kind of anything. If you want to go out of town with them, you have to get permission, all that kind of stuff. So it's it's challenging, but I wouldn't change it. I mean, it was a really important part of our life, and of course we ended up with 2 amazing children through it. But even if that hadn't happened, I think it was a positive experience for us.
I think I've thought a lot about what other jobs could I do, or what other career paths could I have taken. But I think ultimately what feels the most important to me is people and relationships, and just helping people through tough times, and that seems like the best use of my time. So when I think of what I would spend 40 hours a week doing or more, or something, that seems like the only thing I can really justify.
Sure that we as professionals are all talking to each other, that we know what the different agencies are that are available, who are the therapists that do this kind of work, who are the nurses and doctors that do this kind of work, what kind of public agencies are there, what kind of nonprofits are out there, so that we can really reach out and connect one another to try to kind of make this net, right? So that people don't fall through the cracks. People are kind of held by this net that we're all working to create. And it's not perfect, and not everybody is reached, and not everybody who wants and deserves help is able to get it. But our goal, for the most part, is to sort of connect one another as best we can, so that we know who are these vulnerable populations, who are the people that work well with these populations. Cultural competency is really important, so understanding another person's culture and background, not assuming that my culture and my background is necessarily shared. So making sure that we're all connected and we're all talking, and we know what services are out there, so that if I get a call about a family, maybe I'm not the best person for that family, but I know somebody that I can call and I can connect them. I think that it's our responsibility to make sure that we don't remain isolated and don't assume that we know everyone and everything out there, and keep working to expand our network for people who need help.
The government gives a certain amount of money for preschool, for kids, for disadvantaged children. But there's 1,200 children on the waiting list every year, and there's 200 slots. There's enough funding for 200 kids out of 1,200. So the government is doing some, but it can't possibly do enough. You know, there are many, many children that do not receive the services that they need, because it's, again, a lot of people don't realize there's so much that happens between the ages of 0 and 5. They figure, well, there's public school, you know, by the time when they go to kindergarten, they'll get everything they need. So the government at this point can't, you know, is not doing enough, because it's just our society has not focused on what the needs are. We know that $1 invested in early childhood education saves a community $9, up to $9 in the future. So if we were really to look at it, you know, the government could invest a lot more in this population, in this younger population, but there's much more need for education to understand that the investment at this young age is really going to pay off. You know, it's really going to help communities be more solid, have less crime, have less difficulties, have less homelessness. So it'd be great if we had more government funding, but because we don't, I think nonprofits like Step Up Ventura need to work on helping, you know, find people in the community that can afford to help these families, because the tax dollar is not going to be sufficient.
The children of today are, you know, the leaders of tomorrow. They're our future, and if we don't invest in children and in youth now, I mean, you're basically saying that you don't care what's going to happen down the road. And like it or not, the Hispanic population is growing. It's huge. It's going to be one of the largest minority, and so it's a really significant part of our population on the national level. So that's one basic reason. It's like, these are the kids that are going to be making decisions down the road. You know, we want everybody to have a good future.
People are scared away from getting an emotional involvement with the situation. So it's not for everybody. But I think that it resonates with a lot of people. And the most important thing is to know that these kids are good kids. All right? They're not juvenile delinquents. A lot of times it's portrayed on TV as these kids are bad, but they're not. They just are reacting to trauma, and you can have a lot of fun with kids, and you can pick the age group that you want to deal with. Some people like teenagers, some people like little kids, some people like middle schoolers. So or even the kids that are over 18 that need really lessons in how to be a responsible adult. So you know, there's somebody for everybody, and I think that it's a great use of people's time when they have
kids need us to see them and to give them the benefit of the doubt and to help them in whatever way we can, in whatever circumstance that they're in. But people who, you know, feel they have some kind of calling to be a foster parent, I think, you know, don't be afraid. It's a great experience, and it's painful, but it's what those kids need. And if you can open up your home, then that's a huge
No child exists on his or her own. A child is always part of a fabric of other people, family, school, community. church, whatever kind of other groups a child is part of, right, affect the child. And so one of the things that I've really developed over time working with families is that unless it's a much older kid, like a teenager, but even in those cases, I always want to work with the other people in that child's life. So bringing a young child into therapy, there's really only so much that can happen between me and the little one, right? It's much more important to me that that child's caregivers have what they need so that they can support this child as the child grows. So sometimes I think it's a misunderstanding to see it as a situation where, the child goes to therapy, or the child has help, or the child needs this, or the child needs that. It's almost always the family that actually could use some support. Maybe the parents can develop some skills or process some of their own trauma or learn a little bit about child development. And that strengthens the child, that strengthens the family. And so I would hope that we could expand sort of our understanding of psychology, maybe in general, to see that we're not so separate, that human beings are connected, and especially the younger the person is, the more connected they are to the people around them. And so really making sure that not only children, but also parents and caregivers, teachers, communities have the resources that they need to help raise children, help raise families, and kind of help raise one another, would be something that I hope people would sort of appreciate and understand, and is hopefully something that they experience when they come into therapy, that they're not alone, and that the more people working together, more people working together strengthens families and strengthens communities.